We'll start in another, go ahead.
I did.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Pull your microphone up, Counselor.
Yeah. It's here.
Pull it up.
Okay. Okay, welcome, everybody. This is the Land and Buildings Committee. Today is August 26th. It's 6:30, and we are going to hold a committee meeting tonight on the parking garage. And basically, what it's going to be is, last meeting we had a figure for replacing doing a complete repair on the parking garage. And, well, I should say also that all committee members are present now. So last time we had the meeting, Wes ran us through what it would cost to redo the whole garage, the facade, elevator, lights, new decking and everything. And tell you the truth, I didn't hear a lot of comment from the committee or the council of any kind of a direction. So I got back together with West and asked him to come up with other alternatives of what we could do to the garage, and to present that to the council, and to see if we can kind of decide on some direction that we want to go with this thing. So I'm going to turn it over to West. Most of it is previous stuff, but there is a page of new things. Go ahead. Thank you, West.
Okay, so basically,
Press, pull the microphone over.
this is a new briefing with just one slide from the last presentation. And that really is on the money side of the house, so we can do some comparisons. I was asked for to price out two options. One is decommissioning, the other is deconstruction, or otherwise basically disassembly. And looking at the decommissioning, I had to make some assumptions over what we were thinking about doing, and that developed the scope of work. So from the standpoint of it, we were looking at doing something to the roof enough, so it's a 5 to 10 years life before we make another decision. We want to try to minimize annual maintenance costs in the interim, convert the second level to a roof. Some facade work, what that piece is, I don't know at this point. And the critical scope of work on this is basically we have to remove the asphalt surface on the second level deck, put a membrane down, do spot repairs to the third deck to ensure it can carry the snow load for the 5 to 10 years, and then close stairwells and fence off the ramps to try to minimize the homeless use of the second and third level. The other one is basically deconstruction, which is basically you bring the roof, bring the building down up to the point it's flush with the existing second deck, and the second deck becomes a roof. I made the assumption at this point that we'd work with the private building owner, because at that point there is no parking garage over it, and they would take over responsibility after we converted it to a roof for future maintenance of it. Basically, we've got to remove all the structural steel above the roof. We've got to fill in the stairwells that are there, move the building's chillers that are up right now on the south stairwell all the way down to the roof, and then block wall in the entrance to the north stairwell, figuring that we'd have to do something on the south stairwell to give them access to the chiller. Okay, these are the costs that we came up with at the previous meeting, just as a reminder. So for rehabilitating both decks, it was just over $4.5 million. For rehabilitating just the second deck, it was just under 4. Building new was 10.8 million. And if we rehabilitated either both decks or the second deck, the private party had about $73,000 of their work that they would have to participate in. Okay, for decommissioning, what I had to do is do a low end and a high end range depending upon what decisions that we made and in regards to what level of risk the contractor's willing to take. So if you look at the decommissioning option, which is basically repair the second deck as a roof, the low end is someplace around $860,000, the high end is about $1.5 million. For deconstruction, it's about 1.5 million to 2.5, and a lot of that is associated with what the price of the risk is going to be for doing the deconstruction while there's still businesses in operation underneath the building. If you compare the alternatives, and you can see on the top line as I have the price for the two rehabilitation options, and I've compared it against what is an average cost. So if we average out for repairing the second deck as a roof of a B, about 1.1, 1.2 million, the difference is 3.34 million between rehabilitating both decks and about 2.7 for rehabilitating just the second deck. For deconstruction, we're saving about 2.5 million for repairing both decks and about 1.8 for repairing just the second deck. That's the difference between the options. Again, some of the considerations that we'll need to think of is how much parking is needed in downtown now, 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years, because that's going to be the lifespan of whatever we do to that building if we do rehabilitate it. And then the real question is, how long will the repaired parking garage meet the city's needs in the long term beyond that time frame? And is the city going to charge for parking downtown? And how much the city should charge for parking in the future if it's going to use that model to fund the operations and maintenance of the parking garage? And this is just a repeat of the slide to help generate discussion. Questions?
Any questions from the committee?
Can you compare the life of the repairs in the repair and deconstruct scenarios versus the rehabilitate option? In other words, are we spending whatever it is, 1.5, 2.5 million for 5 to 10 years versus spending 4.5 to 3.8 million for 25 years?
If you're doing the two rehabilitate options, those are 20-year lifespans before you have to go and start doing some major work to it again. If you're talking about really the deconstruction estimate, once we deconstruct it, we have no more lifespan worries, because theoretically we'll be turning over all the infrastructure to the property owner, and the city doesn't have any cost at that point.
And
The decommissioning is just really enough to buy time for a future city council to make a decision what they want to do with the parking garage. It's not an option. You're still losing structure on the building. It's still corroding. It's still, aging on that piece, and something's going to have to be done in the future, whether it's rehabilitated or deconstruction.
So, but if you pursue that option, and then you add the difference of if you decide to reconstruct it later, it's the same as basically
Correct. It's
repairing
added.
the second deck. So that one seems to be an option to not have on the table.
It's additive at that point.
Thank you. So, do other people agree with that?
Well, I think what we were trying to do, Henry, when we had the last meeting and it was 4.5 million to do the whole thing, didn't look like there was a lot of enthusiasm to do that. I don't know. Maybe there is. But then you got to think, okay, we do the 4.5 million, maybe 5. I don't know what it's going to come in at. 20, 30 years down the road, whoever's sitting here is going to have the same problem all over again.
But that's true in any parking garage anywhere in New Hampshire.
Yes, it is. I don't disagree. So what we're trying to do is to say if we need more time to think about it, we can fix that first deck, make it waterproof, because I don't know if it's still leaking in there or not. It might be.
It does.
Yeah. And that would be something that would be needed to be done anyway, if we continue on to repair the whole thing. So these are some options. Or we can fix the first deck so it's usable and leave the top deck alone and then challenge that one later on. Is that one of the things?
And that's the second option, is to rehabilitate the second deck.
Rehabilitate the first deck, new ramps, new flooring, and, we can go through with the facade, I guess, and lighting. Go ahead, Scott.
Just one thought to speak of just repairing the second deck or the first deck and not the second deck. When you really look at the price difference,
Yeah.
$700,000. So you can think you're putting 3.8 million into it, and you're yielding half of the potential spaces. And for only an additional 700,000, you're doubling your space. And now, granted, the spaces up on the top don't have a covered roof to them, but for relatively small money at that point, you're doubling your capacity on it.
Right.
Just something to think about in terms of
Oh, yeah,
just doing the first deck.
exactly. I mean, even if you decommission it, it's gonna cost over $1 million if you take the whole thing down. So you'll have that much invested in it, but then, from then on, it's not ours. So, I mean, and you could look to do something somewhere else, or do you just wanna go ahead and fix it? And I mean, I don't, go ahead, Bruce.
Have we done a check of how much it's used?
He's not on the-
Both decks, I mean,
Well, the top deck's not used at all right now because it's blocked off. You can't get up on it.
so that's zero.
That's zero. We have not done I'll say a parking count on the second deck.
Just an estimate. Somebody must have been up there and said it's half full, or,
It's probably gets more use in the wintertime, especially on days that snow is predicted. So on those days, I would say it can be upwards of 80 or 90% filled on the one deck that is open. In the summertime, nicer days, maybe not as much, but I mean, we've got days here where the City Hall parking lot is full to the end, and people are looking on Orange Street or they're going into the garage. So we've definitely seen an uptick in parking demand because of the change of use of some of the buildings downtown over the last year and a half. And the other thing is, the parking garage is not the nicest facility to be parking in these days. If it were fully rehabilitated, new lighting, new paint, exterior stairwell, I think that would go a long way to having people look at it and say, this is a great place to park. So it's tough to compare based on its current condition right now.
Correct. But, I think where we gotta go is, we gotta decide as a committee and as a council, are we gonna fix it or not? That's the decision.
If we're gonna fix it, I think the repairing both decks is the way to
Well,
go.
I agree, if we're gonna do the whole thing. But I mean, if you don't wanna do that, and then have time to think of what else could be available for a price, then, do the lesser. But I mean, I just asked Wes to come back with something that we can discuss other than the complete refurbishing of it. A lot of people in town, that I've heard from aren't too thrilled with the building to begin with. But like you say, if we refurbish it and do the whole thing, it would look a whole lot different, but,
it would seem to me it'd be a good idea before we go too far to find out with the rest of the parking, where are we at? I mean, are we near saturation? I know Beacon West is not full most days. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen it full, even with the old parking. But I think we ought to have some idea of how many spaces are open on a given day the way we are right at the moment.
I think there's quite a few, other than this lot. I mean, I have
This
never-
one's-
I have never been downtown and not been able to find a spot. You might have to walk a little bit, but there's always some spots available.
I guess one of the things the manager said is of concern to me, and that is the change of use downtown has obviously impacted the city parking lot. I mean, I can remember when you could play hockey out here, and now you have trouble squeezing between two cars many days. I just think we ought to know how many spaces we have and what percentage of them are used before we decide not to fix the building.
I mean, I would say want cars downtown, right? I
Right.
mean, that's the whole point of having it downtown, so, I think the fact that, the nature of commerce is changing a little bit downtown, but, it begets other things that can be sustainable, if you have a employer base that is filling up some of the spaces, then they need services like eating establishments and other services, so.
Scott, do you have a comment?
Yeah, just remember we've got the sister parking item, if you will, that was introduced by, I believe, the mayor and Councilor Bounds about the paid parking proposal, that we're waiting for some additional information, and I know the downtown TIF advisory group is going to help and circulate some information as to what the parking demand. So, I mean, this obviously could be a component of that, because if there is the support to do a paid parking proposal, then that certainly is going to include the garage use, because, you know, if you're charging, you need to charge for all the downtown spots. Otherwise, if you only charge in the garage, everybody will search around and try to find an on-street spot, and vice versa. So, you know, maybe once some of that information comes back, which hopefully would be back over the next couple of weeks, we can dovetail it in and look at spaces in need and talk about what might be an appropriate price point for parking, and see how that ties into helping fund this, because that'll be the key piece, is where do we, you know, where do we find funds? And obviously, we know we're talking about a 20-year lifespan, you know, maybe up to 25. Realistically, we probably ought to be looking at a 20-year, you know, bond on this, so we can start to do some of the math and into the parking spaces and see if there's support to use that as at least a partial way to help fund it.
Okay. So tonight isn't, you know, required to have some kind of decision on what we're going to do. Just wanted to present some additional information that Wes came up with, and I appreciate Wes's work on this to give some other ideas. So, is there any other comment?
Yeah. You know, Bob, when you look at the figures, to build new, you're talking about $11 million. And, you know, to fix both decks, you're talking four, maybe five. That seems to be, to me, that would be a way to go.
Okay.
But I agree with Bruce that before we make a final decision, I think we need an inventory of parking spaces and what's available and what isn't available.
We've already had maybe, how many studies, Scott? I know that we've had at least 3.
I think they've been more or less informal. I don't, at least not in my time here, and I could be wrong, but I don't believe there's been a paid consultant who's come in and identified what the demand is, where the peak demand is, whether it's full day or part day, and that type of stuff yet. So I think informally, people have gone around and counted spaces and counted occupancy at different times and done it at that level. But I don't, at least in my 8 years, there hasn't been a consultant coming in to identify. I think it's good information. I think that the mayor working with the TIF board and having that conversation to identify the businesses downtown, to say, what is your parking demand for your employees on an average day, and possibly your customers too, and how much of that are you supporting on your own property, and how much are you leaning on the public infrastructure for that parking. So I think that could be a real useful piece of information once it's collected and compiled in a usable format.
Okay, I agree. So I guess think about this, and because Wes is going to need some advice on which way he has to go for maintenance of the garage. You know, he's got to put in a line item for repairs and all that kind of stuff. So. That would help him on his direction. But, I mean, even if we said right now, let's repair the whole thing and fix it, it would be a year to come up with the schematics and the engineering and all that kind of stuff, Wes.
Correct.
And then, so this is 1920, so probably wouldn't be till 21.
Be about 2 years' worth of construction.
Yeah. So we're talking maybe start in spring of 21 or so, if we decided that.
Could be,
If we're lucky.
if we're lucky.
Okay. So, guess we're looking 21, 22. So, anyway, okay. If there's anybody in the audience that would like to voice their opinion on this, be glad to hear from you. Is there anybody? John, go ahead. Good to see you, John.
Good to see you as well, Counselor. John Moriarty, thank you for taking public input today. I'd like to echo some of what I heard, and I know it's not news to you, and thank Wes for making the obvious, making the relevant comment that we don't really know what our parking needs are. To my knowledge, there's a company, AES or something, 3 initials, that did a destination origination study. I remember meeting the guy who was counting parking spaces and asking him what he was doing, and that's what he explained to me. I forget what year that was. The purpose was not actually to study parking. The purpose was to study traffic, but the parking, the destination part of that translated from parking. So that is true. There has not been a dedicated formal study on parking, just a parking study used for other purposes. In addition to that, Councillor, I was asked years ago to do an informal analysis of parking, and I did quite an undertaking with that. I can tell you that at the time I knew what the total number of parking spaces, private and public, were in downtown. At the time that I did that, the parking garage had both decks open. At that time, we had a similar but different kind of vacancy occupancy ratio. So clearly a lot of things have changed, but the interesting thing and granted it was an amateur study, but it was maybe even more in-depth than a professional study, who knows, is that we didn't at that time even approach a 50% usage rate of our existing parking. Surface level was certainly higher. The parking garage was, skewed that average in a downward fashion. All that to say, I don't really know what the parking demand is, and it would be worthwhile to understand that better, and especially in terms of how the marketplace is going to change over the next few years. My next comment, I intend humorously, and I hope it's received as such, but as I look at the garage, I touch the garage, I stick my fingers in the cracks where bricks used to be, and I'm pondering the conversation here, and I'm immediately struck by the deliberation and the feeling that, boy, this is not good and we have to do something. I'm struck by the same translated engineering conversations about Chernobyl and what to do about the collapsing sarcophagus. And I guess from my perspective as a good conservative Yankee, I wonder if trying to do something with the parking garage that, from what I understand, was a structure that was not designed to be constructed north of the Mason-Dixon line, was not designed to withstand road salt or a New England winter, that and considering the fact that years ago we put money into it thinking that would stabilize it for, in round numbers, 2 or 3 times the length of time that it did. I'm not questioning any of the engineering or any of the professional investigation that's been done on that, but I do wonder if sometimes our wishful thinking may skew our thought process as to how realistic that is. Again, somebody who spends a fair amount of time looking at the nitty-gritty, I have some pretty significant concerns that any amount of money can robustly stabilize that structure in a way that will really get us beyond the 10-year mark. And again, layperson, I understand, but when I can walk up and literally stick my fingers in the grout lines on the ground floor, I'm wondering, all right, even if we stabilize the parking structure, what is the circumstance for the rest of the structure? Which leads me to my sort of 50,000-foot elevation look at all of this, which is, this is an interesting opportunity. We have a one-way Main Street. We have what we affectionately call the chute, where we contain the buildings, the traffic on both sides. It's 36 feet face-to-face. If we were to do something different, where perhaps we sold a piece of property to a private developer and asked them to develop the kind of investment in downtown that I think we're all seeking, what that would do is, in my mind, is it would create a demand, and with the demand, people would be a lot more lenient on our parking. I've taken a tour of, I call it the Great New England, Northern New England Parking Garage Tour, and I've, from Burlington to Portland, from Boston to Hanover, made a point of touring parking garages. And what I find is that they all are dirty, gross, dim, and not especially attractive. But what makes the difference of how safe you feel on them is how many people are you around. My armchair advice is that we should create a parking problem, and then when we're ready, when we've got people feeling comfortable, then we should spend the money to solve it with a structure if need be. I remember the headline, I think, please don't quote me on this, but I think the headline in the Daily Sun 18 months ago said, City Council declares not one more dime to be spent on parking garage. And so I guess I'm just sort of trying to figure out where we are here, if this is a reversal in direction or if this is by a popular demand that I don't see that we're reinvestigating this, but all that to say, I'm not the least bit critical. I think it's terrific that you guys are being proactive, and if I can be helpful, please count me in, because I will pound the pavement and do whatever is needed to be helpful. I understand there's no perfect solution. Whatever we do is not going to be perfect, but thank you for trying. That's great.
Thank you, John, and I know if you did the study, it's more than just an amateur study, so.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, is there anybody else that wanted to weigh in? Well, really don't have a lot of time, we gotta start the meeting at 7, so, so we'll ponder what we have in front of us, the Land and Buildings Committee, and we'll, at some point, we'll do another, go ahead, Scott.
Just 30 seconds, if I could, just to follow up on Mr. Moriarty's comments, which I think is great. We do annual inspections, we do annual maintenance on the garage. It is a engineer review, it is a safe structure. You will actually see some of the work happening over the next week or two of some of the results of the inspection this year. So yes, there are some gaps, but the structure is safe.
And also, I don't know what our responsibility is on the outside of the building on the lower floor. I don't know if that's ours or not, the outside, I wouldn't think so, but I don't know.
The building itself on the outside would not be ours.
Correct. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, at this time, I'm going to call the meeting adjourned at 6:56.
Can I just interrupt? Are we going to ask the manager to find someone to find out what the usage is?
Well, we can do that during the regular meeting.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.